is light important?
For us photographers, it's all about the light. Even though we need light to take a picture, it's not about how much light we have, but rather the quality and the kind of light that's available to us.
If there's one thing that I've learned over the years, it's that photography takes work. You have to train yourself to see light. Better yet, you have to train yourself to see how your camera sees light.
How many times have you found yourself staring out at what you thought was the perfect location to take a portrait, but to only find that when you snapped the shutter, it was nothing like you thought it would be in your mind?
Well, that's probably because you're as guilty as the rest of us about not thinking about light first and foremost.
Throughout this course on photographic light, we have one goal in mind, and that's to have you fall in love with great light.
During this course, we're going to look at a number of tools to help you create your photographic vision. However, all of these tools, ISO, aperture, shutter speeds, reflectors, all of those things are almost completely irrelevant without light.
Throughout this course on photographic light, we have one goal in mind, and that's to have you fall in love with great light.
We want you to be excited about light. With that being said, let's get started.
So the exposure triangle is probably one of the most foundational concepts in photography. Now I'm sure we've all taken one of those photos that's maybe a little bit blurry, maybe too noisy, too dark, or maybe even just overexposed. Well, the exposure triangle is the reason for all of those things. And when you grasp the exposure triangle, you free yourself up to focus on things like composition, color, or even telling a story. So what makes up the exposure triangle? There are three things that make up the exposure triangle. The first one is aperture, the second is shutter speed, and the third is ISO. So let's take a look at that first thing, aperture. Now the process of aperture actually takes place directly in your camera lens. And the aperture is what allows the quantity of light to reach your camera sensor. Now if you're new to photography, this whole aperture concept can be extremely confusing because in the case of aperture or the f-stop number, the larger the number, the smaller the aperture or the smaller the opening is in your lens. And the smaller the number, the larger the opening. So if you look at this lens right here, and I open it up all the way to its largest aperture, which happens to be its smallest f-stop number. In this case of this lens, it's a 50 millimeter, it's 1.8. Now the lens opens up all the way, it's gonna let in the most amount of light possible. And if I close down that lens to something like f22, its smallest aperture, now just a tiny hole, so now not much light is gonna reach our sensor at this f-stop. Or maybe you want to shoot a very small aperture because we're shooting something like this, a beautiful landscape, and we want everything to be in focus. Well, then we may have to slow down our shutter speed so that we allow a lot more light to get to the sensor through that small opening. So you can see these two components really play off each other. So here's what you need to remember about aperture. Aperture is just the opening inside your lens that determines how much light is going to reach your sensor. The next component in the exposure triangle is the shutter. Now, the shutter controls the duration or how long light is going to be allowed to reach your sensor. If we use a very fast shutter speed, we're going to only allow a very small amount of light to reach your sensor. If we use a very slow shutter speed, we're going to allow a lot of light to reach your sensor. So think of it this way. Pretty simple. The slower the shutter speed, the more light. The faster the shutter speed, the less light. Now, these two components really counter each other when making a correct exposure. Let's just say that you want to shoot a photo wide open at a very large aperture. Well, we might need to speed up our shutter so that not a lot of light comes through the lens in that large opening. One lets light in, the other compensates by controlling how long the light gets to flow towards our sensor. Okay, so we've come to the last component of our exposure triangle, and that is ISO. Now, ISO is what controls our camera's sensitivity to the light. Just like aperture and shutter, ISO can also be used to add or subtract the amount of light within your exposure. Now, when we use a low ISO setting, something let's say around 100 or 200 ISO, our cameras are not very sensitive to the light. So when we use these lower ISOs, we either have to slow down our shutter speed or open up our apertures to let more light into the camera. So let's look at the exposure triangle again under these normal situations. You decide two of the components, and your camera through its meter will determine where to set the third component. Here's what I mean. I might set the ISO in the shutter, and then my camera will determine what the aperture should be to get the correct exposure. Or I will set the ISO and the aperture and let the camera decide what the shutter should be. So how do I decide which component we should set first? Well, it really depends on the type of photography that we're doing. Both portrait and landscape photographers normally worry about the aperture the most, but the question is why? Well, I think it's because the aperture not only deals with the amount of light, but it also deals with how much of our image is in focus as well. Now, if you're a sports or an action photographer, then your concern is definitely shutter speed. Aperture is always second because you want to make sure that you can freeze that motion. This is what I want you to come away with from this lesson. There are three things that make up exposure. They all work together to create your vision. Master them, and you are well on your way to become a lighting master.